Welcome to Historical Combat HQ, where we uncover the darkest chapters of warfare, conflict, and human history with depth, accuracy, and respect. If you're passionate about exploring the past and understanding the stories that shaped our world, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe, like, and comment below to support the channel and help us bring you more powerful documentaries like this. Now let's begin our journey into the haunting history of Auschwitz. The story of Auschwitz begins in the quiet town of Oświęcim, located in southern Poland, a region far from the centers of Nazi power in Germany. Yet, in this unassuming place, the world would witness some of the most horrifying events in human history. To understand how Auschwitz came to symbolize death on an industrial scale, we must first look at the broader context of Nazi ideology and the strategic decisions made by the Third Reich to consolidate power. Now let's begin our journey into the haunting history of Auschwitz. In 1939, just months before the outbreak of World War II, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime set their sights on achieving an unprecedented vision of racial purity. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the beginning of a brutal occupation, which would see the forced relocation and persecution of millions of innocent people. Among the first groups targeted were Jews, political dissidents, intellectuals, Roma, disabled individuals, and those deemed unfit by Nazi racial theories. The Nazis' need for concentration camps began as a means of dealing with political enemies, and it was under these early circumstances that Auschwitz was born. Initially conceived as a detention camp for Polish political prisoners, it was located strategically along major railway lines, making it ideal for transporting prisoners from various parts of occupied Poland and beyond. The first prisoners, mostly Polish resistance fighters and intellectuals, arrived in 1940. The early years of Auschwitz saw horrific brutality, but it was only the beginning of a far darker evolution. By 1941, the Nazis had already constructed a model of their concentration camp system. However, they were now faced with an even more insidious project, the final solution: the systematic and industrialized extermination of Europe's Jewish population. The Nazi leadership under Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich were seeking to create a centralized facility where Jews could be relocated. The relocation was, of course, a euphemism for what was planned was mass murder on an unimaginable scale. Auschwitz, which initially served as a concentration camp for the Polish prisoners of war, was chosen as the site for this larger-scale operation. A key figure in its transformation was Rudolf Höss, the SS commandant of Auschwitz, who would oversee the camp's expansion into the most infamous death camp in history. Under Höss's direction, Auschwitz expanded from a small camp of basic wooden barracks to a sprawling complex consisting of three main sections: Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, Birkenau, and Auschwitz III, Monowitz. These sections, strategically designed for different purposes, would become a factory of death. Auschwitz II, Birkenau, built in 1941, was the heart of the death camp system, with its vast fields of barracks designed to house thousands of prisoners. Birkenau was intentionally located far from the central administrative buildings of Auschwitz I, making it a place isolated from the outside world. This isolation allowed for a level of secrecy and concentration that would enable the Nazis to carry out their horrifying plans without interference. With the completion of Birkenau, the Nazis had the perfect setup for mass extermination, and it was in this period that the camp's selection process was implemented. This selection determined who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers and who would live. Though for many, life inside Auschwitz was as horrific as death itself. The creation of Auschwitz was not an isolated event, but part of a larger systematic effort to annihilate the Jews and other undesirables. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, millions were forcibly relocated to these concentration camps, most of which had little more than primitive facilities, a system of forced labor, and a death sentence waiting in the shadows. Auschwitz would stand at the center of this genocidal system, with an infrastructure designed specifically to eliminate large groups of people in as short a time as possible. The horrors of Auschwitz were not limited to the extermination chambers themselves. Prisoners were subjected to horrific conditions from the very moment of their arrival. Many had no idea of what was about to happen to them. They were packed into cattle cars, often with no food, water, or sanitation for days on end. After enduring these horrific conditions, they arrived at Auschwitz, where they were subjected to the brutal selection process, a euphemism for deciding who would live and who would die. At the heart of Auschwitz, the SS maintained a carefully calculated system of oppression, using the labor of its prisoners to support the Nazi war machine. These prisoners were forced to build and maintain infrastructure, from roads to factories, all while enduring starvation, disease, and brutality. Any form of rebellion or non-compliance was immediately punished with death. Auschwitz's role within the larger framework of Nazi concentration camps and death camps cannot be understated. It was a place where the boundaries of human cruelty were not just tested but stretched beyond recognition. By 1942, after the construction of the gas chambers and crematoria at Birkenau, Auschwitz became the epicenter of the Holocaust, a death factory that would annihilate millions. Even as the horrors of Auschwitz unfolded behind its barbed wire fences, the outside world remained largely unaware of what was happening within. The Nazis were careful to maintain secrecy, and the sheer scale of the atrocities meant that they were able to carry out their operations largely unimpeded for several years. The nature of Auschwitz, the construction of vast crematoria, the systematic killing of thousands, was unimaginable for most people outside of the camp's walls. The few who managed to escape or survive to tell their stories were often met with disbelief. For many, the very concept of such horrors was beyond comprehension. It was in this dark context, with an unrelenting determination to carry out their vision, that Auschwitz began its transformation into the largest and most notorious of the Nazi death camps. Its history would forever be marked by suffering, death, and the loss of countless innocent lives. Auschwitz became a symbol not only of the scale of Nazi cruelty, but of the power of ideology unchecked by morality. As we continue to reflect on the creation of Auschwitz, it is important to remember that this place was not just a concentration camp, but a systematic factory for death, where the full extent of human suffering was realized on an industrial scale. The impact of Auschwitz would resonate long after the camp was liberated, and its legacy serves as a haunting reminder of what happens when prejudice, hatred, and totalitarian power combine to form a deadly and unstoppable force. Auschwitz's transformation from a small Polish military base into the notorious death camp we know today was not an overnight process. It began with the arrival of the first prisoners in 1940, Polish political prisoners, intellectuals, resistance members, and those deemed undesirable by the Nazis. At this early stage, Auschwitz served as a place for those who had fought against the Nazi occupation or had been marked as subversive by the Reich's political apparatus. These first prisoners were subjected to a brutality that would soon escalate to horrific levels. Their numbers were relatively small compared to what Auschwitz would later experience, but the treatment they endured foreshadowed the terror to come. Prisoners were transported by rail in overcrowded cattle cars, with little food, no sanitation, and no concept of what awaited them at the camp. For most, this was their first encounter with the unimaginable cruelty of the Nazi system, and for many, it would also be their last. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, the prisoners were immediately subjected to the infamous selection process, which would become a defining feature of the camp. The selections were designed to determine who would survive and who would be sent to the gas chambers. The very first thing prisoners saw upon disembarking from the trains was the vast expanse of the camp. Long rows of barracks, the towering watchtowers manned by armed SS soldiers, and the barbed wire fences that stretched as far as the eye could see. The cold, sterile environment of Auschwitz was designed to strip prisoners of their identity, dignity, and ultimately their will to resist. For those who survived the selection, life at Auschwitz was a brutal existence of forced labor and unrelenting oppression. Prisoners were used as free labor for the Nazis, working in the camp's infrastructure, constructing roads, factories, and other facilities designed to support the Nazi war effort. The labor was grueling, with long hours, little food, and harsh conditions. Prisoners who faltered in their work or who were deemed unfit were often subjected to physical punishment, and many died from exhaustion, disease, or brutality at the hands of the SS. The brutality of Auschwitz was not only physical. The psychological toll on the prisoners was also immense. Upon arrival, prisoners were stripped of their names and assigned a number, which they were forced to tattoo on their arms. This dehumanizing practice served as a constant reminder of their status as mere commodities to the Nazi regime. In Auschwitz, they were no longer individuals with families, histories, or identities. They were simply numbers in a system designed to exterminate them. Life in the camp was defined by the constant threat of death. The ever-present fear of being selected for the gas chambers haunted every moment of the prisoners' lives. Those who were selected for extermination were led to the gas chambers where they were told that they were going to take a shower. They were herded into rooms designed to look like ordinary shower facilities, but they quickly discovered that the walls were lined with gas vents. Within moments, the gas would be released and the prisoners would die, their bodies later burned in the crematoria. It was an industrial process, carried out with chilling efficiency, and was designed to kill thousands in a matter of hours. For those who survived the selections, life at Auschwitz was a continuous struggle for survival. The camp was overcrowded, and the prisoners were subjected to a brutal routine of forced labor, starvation, and torture. Disease spread quickly in the cramped and unsanitary conditions, with typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses claiming countless lives. Prisoners were given little food, often only a small portion of bread and a meager soup, which was insufficient to sustain them in the harsh conditions. In addition to the physical toll, the psychological toll on the prisoners was devastating. The SS guards at Auschwitz were notorious for their cruelty, subjecting prisoners to daily humiliation and terror. They were often forced to endure physical punishment for the slightest transgression, or even for no reason at all. The guards had no regard for the lives of the prisoners, and they routinely executed those who attempted to escape or resist in any way. The atmosphere at Auschwitz was one of constant fear and despair. Prisoners lived in a state of constant anxiety, unsure if they would survive the next selection, or if they would fall victim to the brutal system of forced labor, starvation, and disease. Every day was a struggle for survival, and many prisoners did not live to see another day. The horrors of Auschwitz were not limited to the prisoners within its walls. The camp was also a place where the SS could carry out their sadistic experiments, often on prisoners who were deemed expendable. Dr. Josef Mengele, one of the most infamous figures associated with Auschwitz, conducted cruel medical experiments on prisoners, including twins, the elderly, and the disabled. His experiments were carried out without any regard for the suffering of the victims, and many of those subjected to them died horrific deaths. As the camp continued to expand, so did the scale of its operations. By 1942, the Nazis had begun to implement their plan for the final solution, the systematic extermination of European Jews. Auschwitz was now at the heart of this plan, and the number of prisoners entering the camp grew exponentially. As the camp expanded, so did the brutality. The labor camps within Auschwitz became increasingly overcrowded, and the death toll mounted at an alarming rate. Despite the relentless cruelty, there were moments of resistance within Auschwitz. Prisoners attempted to escape, although the chances of success were slim. Some smuggled messages out of the camp, warning the outside world of the horrors occurring inside. These messages were vital in informing the world about the atrocities being committed, but the full scale of Auschwitz's brutality would not be known until the camp was liberated in 1945. As we reflect on the early years of Auschwitz, it is important to remember that the suffering of the prisoners was not a random act of violence. It was part of a systematic plan designed to eliminate entire populations in the name of Nazi ideology. Auschwitz, as a symbol of this system, would forever be linked to the horrors of the Holocaust. The prisoners who endured these early years of brutality laid the foundation for the tragedy that would follow, and their stories must never be forgotten. The legacy of these early prisoners, those who survived and those who perished, is one of resilience, courage, and humanity in the face of unimaginable suffering. It is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the most brutal of circumstances. As we continue to learn from the past, we must remember that the stories of those who lived through Auschwitz are not just stories of suffering. They are stories of survival, resistance, and the will to endure. By 1942, the Nazi regime's insidious policies began to take shape on a horrifying scale. The expansion of Auschwitz from a small concentration camp into a vast killing machine reflected the enormity of the Holocaust and its systematic nature. While Auschwitz initially served as a detention center for Polish political prisoners, it was soon restructured into the nerve center of the Nazi extermination campaign. As part of the larger plan, millions of Jews were being forcibly transported from ghettos across Europe to this death camp. Auschwitz began to swell with an influx of Jewish prisoners. Initially, the arrival of Jews was part of the Nazi scheme to deport them from the ghettos and relocate them to labor camps. However, as the months passed and the genocidal ambitions of the regime became clearer, the camp's role began to shift. Auschwitz was no longer just a concentration camp. It had become the epicenter of the mass extermination of European Jews. The methodical arrival of Jews at Auschwitz was an integral part of the Nazis' final solution, and their arrival at the camp was marked by unimaginable horror. The journey to Auschwitz often began in the ghettos, where Jews were forcibly rounded up and crammed into crowded trains. These cattle cars were designed for livestock, not human beings, and they were packed with as many people as could fit. For days, the passengers endured horrendous conditions: no food, no water, and very little air. The trains were often overcrowded, with the stench of human waste permeating the air, and many died en route from the brutal conditions. When the trains finally arrived at Auschwitz, the prisoners were met with a cruel selection process. Those who were deemed unfit for work, such as the elderly, children, and the infirm, were immediately sent to the gas chambers. In many cases, this decision was made quickly and with no remorse. The SS guards, who had long been desensitized to the suffering of others, showed no empathy for the families being torn apart in front of them. Those who were selected for labor, the fortunate ones, were led to barracks where they would begin their new lives as forced laborers. The physical toll of forced labor, however, was almost as deadly as the gas chambers themselves. The conditions within the camp were overcrowded and unsanitary. Disease spread like wildfire, and the lack of food meant that many prisoners were already weak upon their arrival. The work was grueling, with prisoners being forced to construct infrastructure for the Nazis' war machine, often working long hours in extreme conditions with no rest. The survivors of the early years at Auschwitz were forced into a daily cycle of despair, knowing that the ultimate fate of those who arrived after them would likely be no different. The process of extermination had already begun. The gas chambers and crematoria were operational, designed for one purpose: to murder as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. Auschwitz II-Birkenau was the center of the death machine. The layout of the camp was carefully planned to maximize efficiency. The train tracks led directly to the selection area, where new arrivals were herded off the trains and immediately divided into two groups: those who would live and those who would die. The lucky ones were sent to the labor camps, while the rest were marched straight to the gas chambers, disguised as showers. This process was carried out with chilling efficiency, with entire trains of people exterminated within hours of their arrival. The Nazis were meticulous in their planning of the camp's operations. The crematoria were built with the capacity to incinerate thousands of bodies a day. The smell of burning flesh was a constant presence, a haunting reminder of the scale of the atrocity being carried out. The sheer number of people being murdered at Auschwitz was staggering, and the pace of extermination was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Amid this horror, the prisoners of Auschwitz continued to endure. While many perished in the gas chambers or from the brutal conditions of forced labor, some resisted in whatever way they could. One of the most significant forms of resistance within the camp was the effort to smuggle out information about the ongoing genocide. Some prisoners were able to pass along messages to the outside world, despite the immense risks involved. These messages were crucial in alerting the Allies to the horrors taking place in Auschwitz, though the scale of the atrocities remained largely unknown to the outside world for years. Auschwitz's role as a death factory became more evident with each passing month, as the Nazis refined their methods and infrastructure to carry out the final solution. The camp's capacity for mass murder was continually expanded, and by 1943 it had become the largest and most lethal concentration and extermination camp in Nazi-occupied Europe. The camp was a symbol of the Nazis' industrial approach to genocide, with every element of the system, from the trains and gas chambers to the crematoria and forced labor, designed for one purpose: the annihilation of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others who were deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The scale of Auschwitz's operation was mind-boggling. It is estimated that over its years of operation, more than 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz, most of them Jews. But the true horror of Auschwitz wasn't just the sheer number of people killed. It was the systematic nature of the murder. The Nazis approached this genocide with a chilling efficiency that allowed them to eliminate entire communities in a matter of hours. As the war progressed, the expansion of Auschwitz continued to evolve. The number of prisoners increased, as did the number of people sent to die. The camp was a microcosm of the Nazi regime's genocidal ambitions, an industrialized killing machine that would leave a scar on humanity for generations. In remembering the expansion of Auschwitz, we must acknowledge the lives lost in the process. Families were torn apart and entire communities were eradicated. The survivors of Auschwitz, though few, carried with them the memory of what had been lost. As we look back at the horror of this time, we must never forget the individuals who perished in Auschwitz. They were not just statistics, they were people. Fathers, mothers, children, and grandparents. Their lives, like those of the survivors, are forever etched in the history of Auschwitz. The selection process at Auschwitz was one of the most horrifying and dehumanizing aspects of the entire camp system. It was here, upon arrival at the camp, that the fate of tens of thousands of individuals was determined in mere minutes. A chilling example of the efficiency with which the Nazis carried out their genocidal plans, the selections were designed to separate those who would live from those who would die. This brutal process would become a defining feature of the Holocaust, carried out not just at Auschwitz but at other death camps across occupied Europe. Upon arrival, trains filled with prisoners would be directed straight to the unloading docks at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The victims were packed tightly into the cattle cars, many of them exhausted, hungry, and disoriented. The journey from the ghettos to Auschwitz could take days, and the conditions inside the trains were so horrific that many prisoners perished even before they reached the camp. For those who survived the journey, however, the true horror awaited. When the trains came to a halt at Auschwitz, the first thing the prisoners saw was the infamous Arbeit macht frei gate, a cruel and mocking sign that read, "Work sets you free." This message was a cynical lie, as the vast majority of those who arrived would never leave the camp alive. The SS guards, armed with whips and rifles, ordered the prisoners to disembark quickly. The scene was chaotic, filled with screaming, confusion, and the overwhelming sense of fear. As soon as they stepped off the trains, the prisoners were divided into two groups by the SS officers conducting the selections. One group, often consisting of the elderly, the sick, mothers with young children, and those who appeared physically weak, was immediately led toward the gas chambers. The selection process was carried out with cold indifference, as if the lives of these men, women, and children were worth nothing more than the flick of a hand. A simple gesture from the SS officers, left or right, determined whether a prisoner would live to see another day or be led to their death. Those who were deemed fit for labor, primarily young adults and those who appeared to be in good health, were sent in the opposite direction, toward the barracks. However, the illusion of safety was short-lived. Though they were spared the immediate fate of the gas chambers, their survival would be measured in weeks or months, not years. Forced to endure brutal conditions, starvation, and the unrelenting physical demands of labor, most of these prisoners would eventually die from exhaustion or disease. Yet, in that moment, as they were sent toward the barracks, they believed they had been given a chance at life, a fleeting hope that would ultimately be dashed. The gas chambers at Auschwitz were designed to accommodate large numbers of victims at a time. Often, prisoners were told they were being taken to the showers to cleanse themselves after their long journey. The SS officers maintained this cruel deception, knowing that the prisoners were so desperate for any semblance of comfort or normality that they would trust the lie. Once inside, the doors were sealed, and the poison gas, typically Zyklon B, was released. The victims, suffocating in the airtight chamber, would die within minutes. Their bodies would then be transported to the crematoria, where they were incinerated in large furnaces. This industrial scale of killing was meticulously organized, and Auschwitz was equipped to handle the mass slaughter of thousands of people every day. The gas chambers were capable of exterminating 2,000 to 3,000 people in a single day. The sheer numbers were staggering. An entire city's worth of people could be exterminated within a matter of hours. The selection process was not only horrific in its brutal efficiency, but also in the emotional toll it exacted on the prisoners. Families were torn apart as mothers were separated from their children, husbands from their wives. In some cases, parents were forced to watch as their children were led away to die. The psychological trauma of this process was incomprehensible. The prisoners who survived the initial selection often faced years of suffering, but those who were sent directly to the gas chambers never had a chance to say goodbye, to hold on to any hope. Auschwitz was not alone in conducting selections. Similar processes were carried out at other extermination camps, such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Chelmno. However, Auschwitz became the most infamous of them all due to the scale of its operations. It was the largest of the Nazi death camps, and it would eventually become the site of the systematic murder of over 1.1 million people, most of them Jews. It's important to understand that the selections at Auschwitz were part of a broader strategy to annihilate entire populations. The Nazis targeted not only Jews but also Romani people, disabled individuals, Polish political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others deemed undesirable by the regime. The scale of this destruction was unprecedented, and it is estimated that approximately 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, perished in the Holocaust. Auschwitz, with its ruthless selection process, played a central role in this genocide. As the war progressed and the number of people arriving at Auschwitz grew, the SS expanded the camp's operations to keep pace with the genocide. New gas chambers and crematoria were built, and the infrastructure of the camp was further developed to accommodate the massive influx of victims. Auschwitz was no longer just a concentration camp. It had become the epicenter of the final solution, where the Nazis carried out their mission of exterminating entire groups of people. In reflecting on the selection process, we must remember the victims, their names, and their faces. They were not just numbers, they were individuals with lives, families, and dreams. They were the sons, daughters, mothers, and fathers of communities that would be destroyed by the Nazi regime. The cruelty of the selection process serves as a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity, but it also serves as a testament to the resilience of those who survived. The selection process at Auschwitz is a symbol of the profound horror that permeated the Holocaust. It was a process of dehumanization, where people were reduced to mere objects, their lives determined by the cold calculations of the Nazis. But even in the face of such evil, the stories of survival, resistance, and remembrance remind us that the victims were not forgotten. Their voices, though silenced in death, continue to speak to us today, urging us to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. Among the many horrors that unfolded at Auschwitz, few were as insidious and systematic as the mass murders carried out in the gas chambers and crematoria. The Nazis' engineering of death, which transformed Auschwitz from a concentration camp into an industrialized extermination facility, was a chilling and calculated operation designed to eliminate entire populations in the most efficient way possible. The gas chambers at Auschwitz, particularly at the Birkenau section of the camp, were central to the Nazis' mass extermination program. While many of the early victims of the camp died from disease, starvation, and forced labor, the true scale of the Holocaust would become clear as the gas chambers and crematoria became the primary tools of mass murder. The Nazis built these facilities with the express purpose of systematically killing as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. Auschwitz's gas chambers were built with meticulous precision. They were large, windowless structures designed to hold as many victims as possible. The victims, after disembarking from the trains, were told they were going to take showers to cleanse themselves after their long, exhausting journey. The SS guards used this deception to calm the prisoners, knowing full well that the showers were nothing more than a prelude to death. The victims, disoriented and hopeful for a moment of respite, were herded into these sealed chambers, often in groups of several hundred at a time. Once the chamber was full, the doors were sealed, and the process of execution began. The SS officers would then release Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide used to exterminate pests, into the chamber through small vents in the ceiling. Within minutes, the gas would begin to take effect, suffocating the victims. The entire process, from the moment the doors were closed to the final death, took only a matter of minutes. But for those inside, it must have felt like an eternity. The victims, many of whom were children, mothers, and elderly people, died in agony, gasping for air in a futile attempt to escape the poison. The screams of those trapped inside were reportedly heard outside, but there was nothing anyone could do. It is said that the sound of those screams still haunts the survivors of the camp who witnessed this horrific process. Those who died in the gas chambers were reduced to nothing more than bodies, their identities and memories wiped away in an instant. But in death, their suffering did not end. Afterward, their bodies were quickly disposed of in the camp's crematoria, where they were incinerated in large furnaces. The crematoria at Auschwitz were designed to handle the staggering number of bodies that needed to be disposed of daily. The Nazis knew that if the scale of their mass murder were ever discovered, the evidence would be overwhelming. They made sure to burn the bodies as quickly as possible to eliminate any trace of the genocide. The crematoria were built with large furnaces capable of incinerating hundreds of bodies a day. The burning of these bodies became a continuous, soul-crushing process that lasted day and night. The sheer scale of the killings was staggering. Auschwitz was equipped with 4 large crematoria, each capable of handling thousands of bodies per day. The SS meticulously coordinated the mass extermination of Jews, Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, disabled individuals, and anyone else deemed undesirable by the regime. By the end of the war, it is estimated that over 1.1 million people had been murdered at Auschwitz, most of them in the gas chambers. The victims were not just statistics. They were real people with lives, families, and dreams, each one an individual whose existence was wiped from history by the Nazis' genocidal ambition. The process of burning the bodies in the crematoria was as methodical as the rest of the camp's operations. After the victims were killed in the gas chambers, their bodies were removed and transported to the crematoriums. The bodies were often piled high, sometimes as many as several hundred at a time, waiting for the incineration process to begin. It's believed that the SS used the bodies of the dead to fuel the fires, further compounding the cruelty of the situation. At times, the number of bodies overwhelmed the camp's ability to dispose of them, and mass graves were dug in nearby forests to bury the excess. Even in these circumstances, the Nazis showed no remorse or consideration for the dignity of the dead. To understand the depths of depravity that allowed this to happen, one must recognize the Nazi ideology that led to this mass murder. The belief that certain groups of people were subhuman, Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and others, was ingrained in the ideology of the regime. This belief justified the systematic extermination of millions of innocent people, not as an act of war, but as a matter of racial purity. The gas chambers and crematoria were not just tools of death. They were part of a larger machine designed to erase entire populations from existence. It is crucial to note that Auschwitz was not the only place where such horrors were carried out. The Nazis built a network of extermination camps, including Treblinka, Sobibor, and Chelmno, where similar methods of mass murder were employed. However, Auschwitz was the largest and most infamous of these camps. The scale of the killing at Auschwitz was unlike anything the world had ever seen, and it became the emblem of the Nazis' industrial approach to genocide. The survivors of Auschwitz, many of whom were forced to work in the crematoria or witnessed the deaths of their loved ones, carried the trauma of what they saw for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll of the experience was immense, and many survivors found it difficult to speak about the horrors they had witnessed for years after the war. For those who had lost their families and were left with nothing but memories of the gas chambers and crematoria, healing seemed impossible. The legacy of Auschwitz is not just about the death of over 1 million people. It is also about the dehumanization of those who lived through it, the loss of entire communities, and the destruction of cultures. It is about remembering the victims, not as statistics, but as human beings who lived and loved and dreamed. people whose lives were violently and cruelly taken. As we remember the horrors of the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz, we must pledge to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. We must teach future generations about the evil that took place, not just in the context of World War II, but as a warning against the dangers of unchecked hatred, bigotry, and racism. Auschwitz stands as a powerful reminder that genocide is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a threat that still looms over humanity today. The gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz are silent now, but the memory of what happened there speaks to us. It speaks of suffering, loss, and the enduring need for remembrance. For the millions who perished, we must ensure that their voices are never forgotten. While the gas chambers and crematoria represent the most horrifying and immediate aspect of the Auschwitz extermination camp, another crucial element of the Holocaust was the use of forced labor. Auschwitz was not simply a site of mass murder. It was also an industrial hub, where the Nazis exploited prisoners for labor in a variety of industries, from armaments production to construction and more. This grueling, backbreaking work was a key part of the Nazi strategy for sustaining the war effort, and it subjected thousands of prisoners to horrific conditions that ultimately contributed to their early deaths. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, after surviving the brutal selection process, the majority of prisoners who were deemed fit for labor were not given any reprieve. Instead, they were subjected to a life of unimaginable hardship. The barracks at Auschwitz were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and unsanitary, with barely enough space for each prisoner to sleep. The camp had been designed to hold a large number of people in as small a space as possible, and the prisoners were packed into the barracks like sardines, with little room for movement or comfort. Once the prisoners were assigned to the various labor details, their lives became an endless cycle of grueling work, starvation, and abuse. The work assignments were brutal, ranging from construction projects to mining to working in the camp's industrial facilities. One of the most notorious labor assignments was at the WWII, an industrial complex built near Auschwitz, where prisoners were forced to work in slave labor for the IG Farben Corporation, one of the largest chemical companies in Nazi Germany. The WWII produced synthetic rubber and other materials essential to the Nazi war machine. For those who worked there, the conditions were appalling. Prisoners working at the WWII factory were forced to work long hours, often from sunrise to sunset, in dangerous and unsafe conditions. The factory itself was filthy, with toxic chemicals and gases that caused severe illnesses, from respiratory issues to burns. There was no concern for safety or the well-being of the workers, and the prisoners were subjected to long hours of backbreaking labor without any proper equipment or protection. Many of them died from exhaustion, disease, or accidents while working at the factory. For those who managed to survive the work itself, the lack of food and proper shelter slowly eroded their health and spirit, leaving them vulnerable to disease and death. The forced labor system at Auschwitz was designed to exploit the prisoners to the fullest, often working them to death. Prisoners were given meager rations of food, barely enough to keep them alive. The Nazi guards would frequently conduct brutal roll calls where prisoners were counted in freezing temperatures for hours, sometimes for no reason at all. This constant dehumanization was compounded by physical abuse and the ever-present threat of execution or transport to the gas chambers. The prisoners had little to no protection from the brutal treatment they received at the hands of the SS, who relished in their cruelty. These laborers were seen as expendable, their only purpose being to support the Nazi war effort, and when they were no longer useful, to be disposed of, either through murder, starvation, or the harsh conditions. The prisoners who worked in the various labor camps were also forced to endure punishments and torture. Those who were unable to keep up with the grueling work, or who tried to escape, were subjected to brutal beatings, executions, or starvation. The SS guards were known for their cruelty, and they would often use the prisoners as scapegoats for any problems within the camp. If something went wrong, whether it was a missed work quota or an accident, prisoners were punished collectively. Sometimes entire groups of prisoners were sent to the gas chambers as a form of retribution. Even those prisoners who were sick, injured, or too weak to work were forced to labor under these dire conditions, often leading to their deaths from exhaustion or disease. One of the most harrowing aspects of the forced labor at Auschwitz was the lack of medical care. Prisoners who fell ill or were injured while working were not given any assistance. Medical care was a luxury reserved only for the SS personnel and the privileged few within the camp. For the prisoners, there were no doctors, no medicine, and no hope of recovery. Those who fell ill were often left to suffer in their barracks until they died. In some cases, prisoners were subjected to grotesque medical experiments, conducted by Nazi doctors who had no concern for the health or well-being of their subjects. These experiments were part of the twisted ideology of racial superiority that the Nazis espoused, and they added another layer of suffering to the already appalling conditions at Auschwitz. The lack of food and proper nutrition was another key factor that contributed to the early deaths of many prisoners. The meager rations they were given consisted mainly of watery soup, bread, and occasionally a small amount of margarine or sausage. This inadequate diet left the prisoners emaciated and weakened, and many succumbed to starvation or malnutrition. Some prisoners were forced to scavenge for food in the fields or the nearby forests, often putting their lives at risk in doing so. The hunger they experienced was so intense that it led to desperate acts of survival, with some prisoners even resorting to eating grass or rats. The hunger and deprivation were constant companions for those who lived in Auschwitz, and the suffering was exacerbated by the lack of proper clothing and footwear, leaving the prisoners vulnerable to the harsh climate. For those who managed to survive the forced labor and starvation, there was still the ever-present threat of death. The SS guards would often carry out random executions, shooting prisoners for minor offenses or simply out of amusement. Prisoners were also subjected to brutal roll calls, where they were forced to stand in the cold for hours, often without food or water. If a prisoner fell, was unable to stand, or made a misstep, they would be beaten or shot on the spot. This constant fear of death, combined with the physical exhaustion, left many prisoners broken in body and spirit, unable to comprehend the full extent of their suffering. But despite the unbearable conditions, many prisoners resisted. Some attempted to escape, knowing that the odds of survival were slim but unwilling to submit to the death camps without a fight. Others secretly helped each other, passing along information, hiding food, or offering a word of encouragement to keep hope alive. Still, most of the prisoners who survived the labor camps did so only through sheer willpower and the occasional act of rebellion or defiance. They understood that, in Auschwitz, survival was often a matter of luck, and that even the smallest gesture of resistance could provide them with the strength to endure. The forced labor at Auschwitz was not just a matter of physical endurance, it was an attempt by the Nazis to break the spirit of the prisoners. They sought to strip the victims of their humanity, reducing them to mere tools to be used and discarded when they were no longer useful. But despite the horrific conditions, the prisoners' will to survive often prevailed. The strength of the human spirit, even in the face of such unimaginable suffering, became a testament to the resilience of those who endured the horrors of Auschwitz. Behind the horrific machinery of Auschwitz was a carefully orchestrated system of power and control, with the SS at its helm. The Schutzstaffel, or SS, was the elite paramilitary organization responsible for enforcing Nazi policies. And within the walls of Auschwitz, they were the ones who maintained the brutal conditions that allowed for the systematic extermination of millions. The SS acted with near-total impunity, and their role in the camp went beyond merely overseeing the daily operations. They were the architects of genocide. Under their command, Auschwitz was transformed from a labor camp into the largest and deadliest extermination center in the history of humankind. At the top of the command structure in Auschwitz was the camp commandant, the official in charge of the camp's operations, and directly responsible for implementing Nazi policies within the camp. The most infamous of these commandants was Rudolf Höss, who served as the camp's first and longest-serving commandant from 1940 until 1943. Höss's role in the Holocaust is marked by his chillingly methodical approach to mass murder. His tenure at Auschwitz oversaw the construction of the gas chambers and crematoria, as well as the implementation of the mass extermination program. Höss was not just an administrator of a death camp, he was a key figure in the Nazis' genocidal machinery. Höss, like many in the SS, was a product of the brutal and warped ideology of the Nazis. He believed in the racial superiority of the German people and the necessity of eliminating those deemed undesirable. He was tasked with ensuring that Auschwitz operated as efficiently as possible, not only as a labor camp, but as the ultimate center of death. To achieve this, Hus oversaw the daily operations of the camp with an iron fist. He enforced harsh disciplinary measures, and any sign of disobedience was met with swift and often fatal punishment. Prisoners who attempted to escape or who were caught resisting were typically executed publicly as a way to deter others. Hus's role in the development of the gas chambers is particularly notorious. In a post-war testimony, he explained that he was personally involved in the construction of the gas chambers at Auschwitz, believing that mass extermination would be the quickest way to cleanse Europe of its Jewish population. Hus oversaw the implementation of Zyklon B as the primary method of execution, which he claimed was more efficient than the use of previous methods. Under his command, the death toll at Auschwitz escalated exponentially. When Hus was asked during his post-war trial why he had participated in such atrocities, he coldly stated that it was simply his duty as a soldier to carry out orders, revealing the chilling extent to which the Nazi ideology had dehumanized those who were tasked with carrying out its genocidal policies. Hus was eventually captured by the Allies after the war, and he was tried and convicted for his crimes. He was sentenced to death and executed at Auschwitz in 1947, the very place where he had orchestrated the deaths of so many. His execution was symbolic in many ways, serving as a reminder that those who carried out such atrocities would eventually be held accountable. However, Hus's trial and execution also highlighted the greater issue. While individual perpetrators could be tried and punished, the full scope of the responsibility for the Holocaust lay with the entire Nazi regime, with Adolf Hitler at its helm. But Hus was not alone in his pursuit of death and destruction. The SS leadership at Auschwitz was a network of officers and administrators, each with their role in facilitating the horrors of the camp. The deputy commandant, Josef Kramer, for instance, was known for his brutal treatment of prisoners and his role in overseeing the extermination process at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Often referred to as the Beast of Belsen for his later role at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Kramer was a sadistic officer who took pleasure in the suffering of those under his control. There were also the SS doctors, who performed horrific medical experiments on the prisoners. These men, under the guise of scientific research, subjected innocent people to grotesque procedures to further Nazi racial theories. Dr. Josef Mengele, the most notorious of these doctors, performed inhumane experiments on twins, children, and adults, injecting them with diseases, amputating limbs, and subjecting them to other forms of torture. Mengele's experiments were not only a violation of medical ethics, but also an utter disregard for human life. His belief in the Nazi ideology led him to view his subjects as mere objects for experimentation, to further his warped theories of racial purity and genetic research. The SS guards themselves, though often viewed as mere foot soldiers, played an integral part in the implementation of the camp's genocidal policies. They were responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations, ensuring that prisoners adhered to the camp's brutal rules. The SS guards were notorious for their cruelty, many of them having been trained in sadistic techniques to terrorize the prisoners. They had absolute authority over the camp's inhabitants, and were known for committing random acts of violence, beating prisoners, executing those who did not meet their quotas, or simply out of malicious pleasure. Some guards would force prisoners into horrific acts of submission, knowing that their authority over life and death gave them the power to break even the strongest wills. The training of SS guards was particularly disturbing. They were subjected to a rigorous indoctrination process that reinforced Nazi ideology, teaching them that Jews and other undesirable groups were subhuman and that their extermination was both necessary and justified. This training created an environment where cruelty became normalized and where guards were desensitized to the suffering around them. This psychological conditioning made it easier for the SS to carry out their orders without feeling any remorse. Many guards and officers believed they were serving a higher purpose, fulfilling the will of the Führer and protecting the Aryan race from the perceived dangers posed by Jews, Romani people, and others. The role of the SS in Auschwitz was not just about enforcing the death toll, it was about maintaining an atmosphere of fear, terror, and absolute control. The SS utilized both physical and psychological tactics to break the spirit of the prisoners, constantly reminding them that resistance was futile. But despite the overwhelming power of the SS and the Nazi regime, there were those within the camp who resisted, who fought to maintain their dignity and humanity even in the face of such evil. Some helped one another, others tried to escape, and a few even participated in sabotage or clandestine efforts to thwart the Nazis' plans. For these acts of resistance, however small or seemingly insignificant, the SS responded with swift and brutal retaliation. In the aftermath of the war, the responsibility of the SS officers was not limited to those directly involved in the murders. The organization itself as a whole was responsible for the atrocities committed in Auschwitz and other camps. Following the end of the war, the Allies sought to bring the leaders of the SS to trial for their roles in the Holocaust. Many were captured and tried at the Nuremberg trials, but some managed to evade justice, fleeing to countries that offered them asylum. It wasn't until decades later that some of these individuals were hunted down and brought to trial. The SS's role in Auschwitz and the Holocaust is a stark reminder of how a powerful, organized force can shape history through sheer brutality. Their actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger systematic plan to exterminate millions, based on an ideology that justified mass murder on an industrial scale. The legacy of the SS remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, a reminder of the potential for cruelty that exists when hate and prejudice are allowed to run rampant. The liberation of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, marked the end of a horrific chapter in human history. As the Soviet Red Army advanced into Eastern Europe, they encountered the remnants of what was once the largest and most infamous death camp in the Nazi regime. Auschwitz, which had been the site of unimaginable suffering for over 5 years, was now abandoned by its Nazi captors who had attempted to cover their tracks and erase the evidence of their crimes. But as the soldiers of the Red Army entered the camp, they uncovered a devastating scene of death, destruction, and a long legacy of human misery. By the time the Soviet forces arrived at Auschwitz, the Nazis had already begun their evacuation of the camp. The prisoners, now severely weakened by malnutrition, disease, and years of brutal labor, were forced on death marches away from the camp. Many of them died along the way, either from exhaustion, starvation, or the brutal treatment by the retreating German soldiers. The remaining prisoners, those too sick or too weak to be moved, were left behind in the camp, in a state of near total despair. When the Soviet troops arrived, they found Auschwitz in a state of desolation. The gas chambers and crematoria had been destroyed in a final effort by the Nazis to conceal their crimes. However, the devastation was clear for all to see. The soldiers discovered the remnants of mass graves, piles of corpses, and the haunting traces of the genocide that had been carried out there. The camp was littered with evidence of the millions of people who had been murdered, their lives extinguished in an industrialized process of extermination that had left an indelible mark on human history. For the survivors, liberation was a bittersweet moment. Many had endured unspeakable suffering, and while the arrival of the Soviet forces marked the end of the Nazi reign of terror, it did not immediately bring the relief or healing they so desperately needed. Upon liberation, the survivors were weak, emaciated, and traumatized. Some had lost entire families, and many had endured physical and emotional scars that would never heal. The sense of relief that came with freedom was tempered by the overwhelming loss of loved ones and the utter devastation of their lives. The liberation of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, marked the end of a horrific chapter in human history. As the Soviet Red Army advanced into Eastern Europe, they encountered the remnants of what was once the largest and most infamous death camp in the Nazi regime. Auschwitz, which had been the site of unimaginable suffering for over 5 years, was now abandoned by its Nazi captors who had attempted to cover their tracks and erase the evidence of their crimes. But as the soldiers of the Red Army entered the camp, they uncovered a devastating scene of death, destruction, and a long legacy of human misery. The Soviet soldiers, upon entering the camp, were confronted by scenes that were difficult to comprehend. Many of them had never witnessed such atrocities, and the scale of the horror left them stunned. They provided what little assistance they could to the survivors, offering food, water, and medical care. But the scale of the suffering was so great that even the Soviet troops were overwhelmed. In the aftermath of liberation, the survivors were taken to makeshift hospitals where they began to recover from their physical ailments. However, their mental and emotional wounds would take much longer to heal. In the months following the liberation, the survivors faced an uncertain future. Many of them had lost their homes and families, and the world they once knew was gone. Some tried to return to their hometowns, only to find that they had been destroyed or that their relatives had perished. The survivors of Auschwitz found themselves living in a world that was forever altered by the events they had witnessed. Some sought refuge in displaced persons DP camps, where they could receive aid and begin to rebuild their lives, while others tried to find new homes or emigrate to countries that would accept them. For many survivors, the trauma they endured at Auschwitz would never leave them. The psychological effects of their experiences were profound, and many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition that was not yet fully understood at the time. The nightmares, flashbacks, and feelings of helplessness lingered long after they had been freed from the camp. The trauma of Auschwitz was not limited to those who were directly imprisoned in the camp. The families of the victims, as well as the broader Jewish community, felt the reverberations of the Holocaust for generations to come. The liberation of Auschwitz also marked the beginning of an important phase in the historical documentation of the Holocaust. As Soviet soldiers and journalists documented what they had discovered, the world began to understand the true scale of the atrocities committed by the Nazis. In the years that followed, survivors would recount their stories, and historians would work tirelessly to piece together the history of Auschwitz and the broader Holocaust. The survivors' testimonies became a crucial part of preserving the memory of the Holocaust, ensuring that the world would never forget the horrors of Auschwitz and the millions of lives lost. One of the most poignant aspects of the liberation was the role that the survivors themselves would play in the subsequent efforts to ensure that the memory of Auschwitz and the Holocaust was never erased. Many of those who survived became witnesses and educators, sharing their stories with the world to ensure that future generations understood the magnitude of the crimes that were committed. They traveled the world, speaking to students, historians, and anyone who would listen, urging the world to remember the lessons of Auschwitz and to fight against the forces of hatred, bigotry, and intolerance. The post-liberation period was also marked by significant challenges in dealing with the legacy of Auschwitz. In the years following the war, efforts were made to preserve the camp as a memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. In 1947, Auschwitz was officially established as a museum, and its preservation became a symbol of the determination to ensure that the horrors of the camp would never be forgotten. The museum became a place of pilgrimage for people from all over the world, many of whom came to pay tribute to the victims and learn about the atrocities that took place there. As the years passed, the survivors of Auschwitz became living witnesses to the past, and their stories continued to serve as a powerful reminder of the need for vigilance in the fight against hate and prejudice. Many survivors went on to live full lives, building families, pursuing careers, and contributing to society, but they never forgot the horrors they had experienced. For them, the liberation of Auschwitz did not erase the pain they had endured, but it allowed them to honor the memory of those who had perished, and to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust were passed on to future generations. The liberation of Auschwitz and the aftermath of the Holocaust were not just the closing of one dark chapter in history. They mark the beginning of a long and ongoing process of healing, education, and remembrance. The survivors, the families of the victims, and the world as a whole would continue to grapple with the profound impact of the Holocaust for years to come. And as new generations are born and old memories begin to fade, we must continue to preserve the lessons of Auschwitz, to remember the past, so that we may prevent such horrors from ever happening again. Thank you for watching this documentary on Historical Combat HQ. If this story moved you or taught you something new, let us know. Comment your most impactful moment below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the past. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed,